I look at this point in time, and some of you may have heard me say this before. My grandfather was a waterman on Casco Bay, and he spent his life doing various kinds of harvesting and boating. And I suspect that in, pick a number, 40 or 50 years, he saw very little change, big change. I'm sure he noticed seasonal changes and cyclic changes, but overall, it was a bay he could understand and count on. But as Kathy mentioned in her opening remarks, the rate of change is phenomenal now. And we have seen in the last 10 years a change that before that we couldn't have predicted or understood. When you think of Hillary's slide, I think her two slides, that incredibly striking picture of McCoy Bay, just a green carpet as far as you can see. And then a few years later, just a brown mud carpet without a sprig of green. That kind of change that fast is wrong. It isn't what we're used to. It isn't what my grandfather saw. He may have seen that cunner, one of my favorite little fish, that we could catch off the backshore of Peaks Island were getting harder to catch, but they were still there. And he could still lobster and he could still scallop. And he just, I'm sure, didn't notice the things we're noticing. And in addition to the things we've talked about tonight, there's so much scary news about the bay, about the ocean. One of our staffer, Mike, who's up in the booth, he used to bring his son down to the marina where we keep our boat because the wall of the marina was a fabulous place to look for algae, to look for sea urchins, to look for starfish, now called sea stars, and on and on. You could find, a dozen or dozens of species. Now that wall is pretty much bare, a few pieces of rockweed hanging off it. And we read about sea stars dying all over the place, and it's hard to find now. I'm sure all of you have interest in the ocean, the beach, the shore, turning over rocks, throughout your life. And you know where you could go find starfish. Well, you can't find them now. And that story goes on, that we're losing species, and we're losing them fast. And we're gaining species. Unfortunately, I don't know of an even trade that we've gotten. We're getting invasive things that have pleasant names like snot. You can't sell it, you can't eat it, it's not fun to play with. So it's a troubling time. And in addition, and we are doing pretty good on the clean water part. We work to get the water clean, but there's so much else happening that's disturbing. So I'm going to now try to go through these a little bit quickly and tell you, well, first of all, that's who we are, Friends of Casco Bay. This is where we work. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Not ocean acidification, although it's not really different, but coastal acidification. And acidification is too much CO2 in the water. And too much CO2 in the water lowers the pH. The pH is still in the basic or alkaline range, but it's headed towards the acidic range, so it's called coastal or ocean acidification. In the coastal arena, science tells us that rather than CO2 coming from the air into the water, we're getting CO2 produced in the water because we have nitrogen acting as a fertilizer coming into the water, causing blooms in microalgae, which are giving off oxygen, but when they die, and they do in a relatively short term, bacteria break them down, and the byproduct of that bacterial breakdown is CO2. So we have huge shots of CO2 coming into the coastal ocean, and that's causing acidification in the mud. Not in the water, but in the mud, and hopefully we'll see why that's important. Here are the people who have helped us with our research. They're from all over the state, and we could not have done this without them. If anyone wants to know in particular about any of our supporters, I'll talk to you during the question and answer out in the lobby. But this is the picture seen around the world. This picture started it, and this picture is by Dr. Mark Green, who's up at St. Joe's College in Standish. And what we see here is a hard clam. This is tiny, tiny hard clam, smaller than the space that you can't make smaller between your fingers. And it's at pH 7.5. And there's another thing up here, another measurement. It's called omega aragonite, which was at 0.5. I'll mention that a little bit later. But if we just think of pH 7.5, here's the clam. Here it is 24 hours later. You can see that it is losing shell. And here it is 72 hours later. And actually, this is a little less dramatic because some of that looks like shell really isn't shell. That's almost back to just flesh. This is what can happen to clams under acidic conditions. Well, we decided, let's see what's happening in Casco Bay. Mark found out what he knows from the lab, where he can control the experiments. So acidic mud is bad for clams, especially bad for clam spat. So we said, let's find out what we have in the mud in Casco Bay. So here's Liz out on our first year of doing these experiments. These are the 14 spots we did those research. The red ones are non-productive clam flats. We got that information from clammers, from constables, from town committees. The green ones are productive clam flats. So we went out there and sampled the pH. This is what we found. The actual hard numbers aren't as important as the relative difference between the productive clam flats had a higher pH than the non-productive clam flats. So the next year, we decided to up our game, get a more expensive, even more expensive pH meter that matches the one Mark Green uses. He does do field work in Casco Bay, particularly in Broad Cove, and we wanted our data to be absolutely comparable with his. And so we added several things to test for that year. You can see here, testing the water pH, testing the mud pH, and other samples that we collected and sent away. Calibration was a huge part of our program. We want to make sure that our data is usable, admissible. Here it is again. You have to hold the probe at that unique angle in order to do pH right with that probe. Here we're scraping off the very surface of the mud to have it sent away in order to determine some really important parameters about that mud. We did 30 stations, pretty good coverage here around the bay. Again, red non-productive, green productive. That's not a hard and fast science. Some of those flats would be non-productive in the lower area, but productive in the upper area. But whoever told us about it felt that it wasn't productive enough to be called a productive clam flat. And here again, productive, higher pH, non-productive, lower pH. The pH of a flat changes throughout the season because of the temperature. And so I say relative because left all by itself, it's going to change in a curve that will go like this. Higher in the spring, higher in the fall, and it dips in the summertime. So we figured out how to do pHs and make sure that they're accurate. And we found some flats that have very low sediment values. Mark Green in his lab exposed clam spat to a pH of 6.8. Every single clam spat in that experiment dissolved. And as Brian was saying, I don't think death by dissolution is a good way to go. But anyway, they all dissolved. We know that productive flats have higher pHs than non-productive, and some other things that go along with and support that. We decided, okay, we sampled some of the clam flats around the bay, 30 of them. What does it look like if you go to one clam flat and you do it every month for 7 months, and you do it from high tide to low tide? So here is Courtney and Callie, who helped us with those experiments. There is the clam flat up at Recompense in Freeport. I know when I say ignore the orange, you wonder what the hell is the orange, but ignore the orange. And here are our sample sites, A, B, C, D, E, and we did that 2 transects down the flat. This is what the pH looks like. Up high is higher pH, although this flat has low pH in general. It's higher up in the high tide zone, goes lower, lower, lower still. We think this is an anomaly because one of Hillary's eelgrass beds had been there, and we were sampling actually in the rhizome. So we can't be sure about that, but if we do further research, we'll clarify that. But Brian mentioned that clammers are clamming up high on the flat. And if this scheme holds for all flats, you can see why. The higher pH means it's easier for them to make a living. So then that mud that we sent away, it went to Dr. Joe Salisbury's lab at UNH, and he calculated the pH, which he does from measuring other parameters. And they plotted the calculated pH versus the pH we got in the field and got this kind of correlation, very significant, which was great news for us. It means we were doing what we thought we were doing. We're getting really good pH values from the flats. This is the 5 stations, A, B, C, D, E, on 4 different dates. And what I will tell you is the literature says clams can easily make a living if this omega aragonite value is 1.6. So we hit that twice on one flat in June. Great. After that, though, look at going down the flat, that goes down. Very difficult for a clam to add shell. And then as the dates go on in the summer, very low aragonite values, which correspond directly with very low pH values. So this just means it's hard for a clam to make a living at a flat that has low pH. The last thing we did that year was get some clam spat from Dr. Beal, put them out, and 19 days later, this one was taken back, and you can see the pitting. And then this is a scanning electron micrograph of that pitting. So that work gave us our marching orders for the next year. We got a lot of clam spat from Brian, and we took pictures of it before we put it out. Then we put some out, and then we took pictures when they got back. And we put them in these enclosures, which are screened from predators. And on this side, there are 20 clam spat in each cylinder. These would be harvested in 1 week, and these would be harvested in 2 weeks. So this is, I think, a very pretty picture. Brian, you must want this one for your albums, because it's pretty. But a very pretty picture of a tiny clam. You know, this bar is 0.5 millimeter. This clam is 1.5 to 2 millimeters, but pretty smooth and shiny. We put them out, or its brothers and sisters, out on the flat, and in a week, they look like this. Not smooth and shiny, but all pitted. And then in 2 weeks, they look like this. Now, this is at the same magnification. What is intriguing is this clam is still growing. Brian, I believe this is the hatchery mark. And then from there out is new growth since we put it on the flat. But it's losing shell here, and it's drying and putting on shell here. But this is what's happening in Casco Bay right now at the flats where the pH isn't favorable. So we're still waiting for data, both from that wonky graph I showed you, but we want to plot the omega aragonite because that's what people in the acidification world talk about. That's the thing they want to know. And we did some really interesting work with one of our board members, Dr. Dan Brazeau, and one of our interns, both of whom are here tonight. Our intern, Ms. Benner, is here, and that's pretty good because her name just changed. But anyway, Ashley is here. So we're waiting for data, but this is it. What does all this tell us? Well, first, I hope that you got from listening, particularly to Brian and Hillary, doing research doesn't always give you the answer, and the system is so variable, you can do a lot of research and still not know answers. You can know you have more male than female crabs, but we don't know why. Well, so we don't get to all the answers, but there are clam flats in Casco Bay with acidic mud, some as low as 6.4. Remember, all the spat dissolved at 6.8. Now, that's not widely, but there is a flat at 6.4. that the pH could fool you. If you just went out in June, you'd have one set of pHs and you might think you know something, but if you went at the end of July, that same place will have different pHs, so it varies over the seasons with temperature. We know from Mark that there are levels of acid that completely dissolve clam flat, and we know that at least in 7 months at one clam flat, we consistently saw the pH decrease the further down the flat you got, except for that last spot. So why are we worried about coastal acidification? Why are we talking about it in face of that scourge that is green crabs? I mean, what's more powerful than that video Chad showed? We agree, green crabs are where it's at. We can see those. Hopefully we can do something about it. Hopefully research is going to lead us to some answers. Even if it just buys time, even if fencing and trapping buys us time, or in the case of acidification, if Brian's experiments putting shell hash on the mud brings the pH up, that gives us time. That means we are going to have clammers who can still clam. But if we get past the green crab problem, that doesn't do anything for the underlying issue we're talking about of coastal acidification. That means if a flat has acidic mud or dead mud, clammers call it, that means spat aren't going to either settle or survive there. That means in 3 years, at the time it takes a clam to grow to legal size on average, there aren't going to be clams there. And if there aren't clams there, what are clammers going to harvest? And then what happens to their income? What happens to their families? What happens to the economic impact as that money would be going for groceries, for mortgages, for truck payments? This is a really big hit to the coastal economy, and that affects all of us. So we need to work on both issues, this one after green crabs, but some of us will keep working on this, and after it I mean in importance, not in time. And the last thing I wanted to mention was, it's not just clams that we're looking at here. There are oyster hatcheries on the coast of Maine, particularly in the Damariscotta River, but there are oyster growers right here in Casco Bay. And at the hatchery, they have the ability to measure the quality of the water coming in, and they can decide not to take it. They could wait till tomorrow to pump when a different tide or whatever has given them more favorable water. We don't get to do that over the clam flats. We have to work on stopping the cause, and that is nitrogen. We're going to have ocean acidification, but we don't need nitrogen on top of it. Where ocean acidification is changing the ocean over the last 100 years from 8.2 to 8.1, we are measuring the water pH right over these flats, and it could be 8 or 8.1, and the mud could be 6, 6.4. That's a phenomenal difference, and that's where the rubber's hitting the road, and that's why we have to get legislation on nitrogen. We have to convince people to stop using fertilizer when you don't need it, and especially don't use it 4 times a year as television ads would have you do. And so we need to pay attention to coastal acidification and nitrogen. And lastly, I want to thank Mike Doan of our staff who supervised all these studies. So when you see Mike, you'll recognize him. And say thank you. Thanks very much.